Okay then, we are now going to talk about neurons. Now before we do, let me give you an analogy. Okay? Ultimately we're trying to study the mind and behavior. That's our goal, that's psychology. The mind, feelings, and behavior, however we define psychology. Okay, so in order to do that, we're going to have to study the brain. But in order to do that, we have to study neurons. But it's kind of like this. Imagine the most complex thing in the world, a space shuttle. Imagine an F-22 fighter, some stealth bomber somewhere. Couldn't be more complex. So imagine somewhere in that little stealth bomber, an F-22 fighter or something else, you have a wire. You have an up and down switch to roll the windows up or roll it down. And you might have a little bolt with a nut on it. Okay? So let's say we're studying the fighter by studying at each bolt. So maybe you can understand how a bolt screws together. You turn it one way, it tightens. You turn it the other way, it loosens. That's kind of what we're doing. We're trying to study the brain by looking at neurons. And I think after a couple days, we're going to get this. A neuron's really just a really small machine. All right? It's going to have input coming in. It's going to make a decision. Is there enough input or is there not enough input? It's going to generate electricity, and it's going to release chemicals. There, that's it. I mean, we'll probably add a few vocabulary words, but that's pretty much it. Stimulus comes in, generates electricity, releases chemicals. So how are you going to understand a jet fighter by studying a bolt? How are you going to study the brain by studying one single cell? There's the disconnect. We're going to come away with a pretty good idea of it. It's like trying to study a Ferrari by looking at the windshield wiper. I mean, you need windshield wipers, but that doesn't make up the whole thing. So somehow or another, just remember that in order for you to understand a neuron, your neurons have to be firing. In order for you to sit there with your favorite song on, you crank it up to 10 and you've got that whatever feeling in your favorite song, that's only based on really small, dumb cells. If you can understand how a whole bunch of really simple cells can create poetry, creativity, love, and hate, great. You understand what most people don't. So please know we're trying to understand the Empire State Building by looking at one single brick on ground level. So there's kind of a disconnect. We do want to get to the brain, but in order to study the brain, we have to look at the neurons. We don't really know how the neurons can create thought. Got it? If you are really confused, good. You're in a good position now. Let's say that neurology started in 1887. Ramon Cajal, he stained a neuron. What does that mean? He got neural tissue, put it on a slide, put it under a microscope, and stained it so he could see that neurons have different structures. Okay? Why do we care about that? Think of the word structures right around the 1880s. Is that a coincidence that right at the same time Wilhelm Wundt came up with structuralism? Yes, it is totally a coincidence. But I wanted to give you that little suspension. Like, oh, wow. So why do we care about this? Well, for over 100 years, everyone's studying neurons. And you know what we found out recently? That's really only a half or maybe even a tenth of the important structures of the brain. But for right now, let's focus on the neurons, and we're going to see what we've recently realized we've been missing. Neurons, imagine, are a tree. On one hand, you got a whole bunch of leaves going all directions. On the other hand, you got roots going in all directions. They got to communicate. They got to pass chemicals back and forth. So that's kind of what a neuron's got to do. A neuron's got to pass chemicals back and forth. Before we move on, look at the primitive paradigm of the neural system in the 1800s. In the 1880s, I guess you can imagine they knew there were blood vessels, and the heart pumps blood through the vessels. So if that's it, maybe that's the way it was for neurons. And I think in 1887, before you realize that no neurons touch each other, neurons were thought of like little tubes, little hoses. And you're going to pump fluid, and that's what makes our arm move. That's what makes our eye blink. The fact that we're pumping hydraulic or neurological fluid to different parts of the brains. Now we look back, and that's laughably stupid. But we realize that no neurons touch each other. In fact, here's what I want you to do. Take your pen, non-dominant hand, write down no neurons touch. A lot of you are struggling. You all right? All right, so let's check it out. Neuron we're basically defined as a nerve cell. That's what it is. What does it do? Its primary goal is to communicate. Its primary goal is to communicate. How does it communicate? Chemically and electrically. A neuron's primary goal is to communicate. And this is important because what if I suggested to you that a neuron is like an illiterate mailman? Carrying letters around, can't read them. Oh, he's taking all the mail and he's putting it in one place and he's picking it up and putting it in another. Still can't read them. So on some level, a neuron's really a dumb and simple creature. It's just the concept of this. Let me try and say it to you this way. Whenever you hurt your toe, and if you don't know how to hurt your toe, let me give you advice. Here's what I want you to do tonight. when the whole family's sleeping, not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse, I'd like you to take your shoes and socks off. Everything's dark, okay? And then I want you to just start running around your coffee table. Will your toe eventually find the coffee table? Yeah, that's going to hurt a lot. Notice you will not hurt your toe. You might injure your toe, but you don't feel pain in your toe. You think you feel pain in your toe, but really you feel pain in your brain, even though your brain has no pain receptors. If you're really confused by that, good. You don't see with your eyes, you see with your brain. You certainly don't hear with your ears, you hear with your brain. All right, here's my analogy with eyes and the brain. If you have a webcam, your webcam doesn't process the visual signal, it just sends it to the CPU, to the video card. Your brain is actually what you see. The neurons in the skin of your toe are too dumb to know they're hurt. All they're going to do is send a signal to the brain. Say, hey, something's happening. Your brain's like, oh, that's pain. You think I'm lying? Let me tell you a story about my aunt. It's a tragic story. All right, she was, mowing the lawn or whatnot. Foot slipped, wet grassy thing. Her foot went on her lawnmower. Bam! Cut off her foot at the ankle. All right. So fortunately, her name was Eileen. All right. But the important part of that, some of you will get that. And of course, where did she work? IHOP. All right then. So that's not right. Why my one-legged aunt work at IHOP? That's not funny at all. So why are we saying this? People who lose a limb, who lose an ear in a tragic blender accident, people who have these problems, they still feel the pain. Imagine your hand is cut off, but you still feel an itch and that hand is not there. How is that possible? How do you scratch something that's not there? Phantom limb. Well done. Phantom limb syndrome points to the fact that we really don't see with our eyes. We don't feel with our hands. We don't feel with our skin. We feel with our brain. Why do I say this? Because I like the analogy of the illiterate postal carrier. The only thing a sensory neuron, the only thing neurons are supposed to do is send signals to the brain and take signals back from the brain. They're not really sure what they're doing. They're just passing on communication. That's a neuron's number one goal, is to communicate. We really have about 15 types of neurons. We certainly don't have to know all of them. This is not a class in neurology. And we will kind of lump them all together. We're going to study, for lack of a better, the average neuron. Although there are different ones that, of course, do different functions because we've got different parts of our body. But they all do have one thing in common. They all reach out and talk to a lot of other neurons. Their number one goal is to communicate. Some neurons can live for over 100 years. It's a random trivia question. Which means the neurons you're born with, that's all you're ever going to get. What if you lose your neurons? You lose them. You're done. How do you lose them? Boxing, head injuries. All right, and if you look at longitudinal studies of professional soccer players who've headed the ball their whole life, by the time they get into further on in their life, 40s and 50 years old, they do show structural brain damage. If you look at the longitudinal studies of NFL and the number of concussions they've had, you have a higher instance of mental illness, a lower level of cognitive function from people who've had repetitive head injuries. If you lose neural tissue, it will not grow back. There is some evidence that scientists now can get rat brains and rat spinal cords to regrow. That's exciting. No one's applied it to humans yet. I don't think we're at the point where we can regrow someone who's paralyzed spinal cord. I don't think we're there yet. And if you kind of think of it, it's kind of gruesome because that means you're taking rats and you're breaking their backs and then you're trying to regrow their tissue. And there is some promising evidence. The next trial might be Labrador retrievers. Does that make you sad? Yeah. Well, chocolate labs taste the best. Just something to think about. Okay, moving on. So what does this mean when we say, when you're when you're born, that's all you get? Babies have more neurons than all of us. So does that mean babies are smarter? No, because I said the number one function of a neuron is to communicate. Babies' brains don't communicate with itself yet. They're really not talking to each other. Go ahead. Why are you hitting a baby? Yes, they are wired with reflexes. It's like, you get a computer fresh out of the box. Before it really has any software installed, it can do some things. But the more you customize a computer to your environment, it's got your favorites, it's got your shortcuts. You've kind of monkeyed with the computer software. Structurally, it's still the same. Now, with the baby's brain, they're going to have 100 billion neurons, probably even more than that. But they don't talk to each other. God forbid one day you are cursed with a little 8-pound poop machine that's going to cost you every penny you ever earn. If you ever have a baby, your number one goal is to make its neurons talk to its other neurons. How do you do that? Stimulation. Okay, now if you stimulate it badly, all right, and you hit the baby or flick the baby over and over and over, its neurons will reach out and talk to each other in a bad way. Its brain will form, for lack of a better word, badly. It'll realize the world's bad. If, on the other hand, you read the baby, cuddle with the baby, let the baby experience, I don't know, soft texture, smooth texture. You take the kid to a museum, you take the kid to this and that, and the kid starts to learn, all of those sensory inputs make neurons reach out and talk to each other. So it's not how many neurons you have. Maybe Einstein had more neurons than all of us. He did have a bigger brain. Did he have more neurons? Maybe. Did he have more neural connections? Yes. So how do you make neural connections? All right, you've got to expose yourself to different stimuli, and here's the word everyone hates. You got to practice. Some of you might have written down a word right now. Maybe, just maybe, in the last 5 minutes you've been in this class, you've learned a word. But if you never think of it again, that connection won't strengthen. Think about it this way. Specifically, any of the fellas. Do you have a friend, your buddy, your boy, who when you see on campus, you see in the hall, you got some ridiculous, elaborate handshaking method that goes on? Any of the fellas looking guilty? No? Okay. All right, someone's like, all right. Well, here's the deal with that. You only do that with friends you've known for a long time. Neurons are the same thing. The more they talk to each other, the better they can talk to each other. We call that practice. So when you study, you're actually strengthening neural connections you learned in class. When you practice at home, you're actually strengthening neural connections you did on the field during practice. So your number one goal is to not only make more neural connections, but to strengthen them. And maybe, just maybe, undo bad ones. Maybe that's what therapy is. Question?
You said that Einstein said have more neurons?
It's possible.
Isn't that he has more wrinkles than faces?
That is possible, but that comes from neurons, yeah. Einstein's brain is still mostly preserved in a lab at Princeton. All right, and I'm not making it up.
Did they unbury him and take it out?
Before he was buried, they took his brain out of his skull. Einstein did agree to his brain being taken. In fact, there's a lab that is the biggest brain collection facility in the world. And we have organ donors in our country. It's even easier to donate your whole brain. So you can see why we would want to study brains of geniuses. Do we want to study brains of people who, whatever the politically correct term for opposite of genius is? Don't raise your hand. I'm not looking for volunteers. What I am saying here, if you understood that, you would be insulted. All right, so what I'm saying to you guys is, yeah, you study the brains post-mortem. You say, oh, this is how their brain was after they've died. Does that mean that that caused what happened when they were alive? I don't know. All right, boys and girls, we're moving on. Let's write down a word called afferent neurons. Afferent neurons transmit information from the sense organs to the brain. Afferent neurons, or afferent signals, translate information from the sense organs to the brain. And you can imagine if we were going to study schizophrenia and someone hears voices. Is their ear sending them the wrong signal? Every single one of us has heard a ringing in our ears. Every single one of us has had, maybe you see a spot floating in front of your eye. Are you hallucinating? Are you mentally ill? Is something wrong with your sensory neurons? So we got afferent, our sensory neurons. Efferent signals are kind of outgoing. They're going to our motor neurons. Efferent signals are leaving the brain. So one way to look at it, afferent is AFF. So you could imagine afferent signals arrive, ARR, and efferent starts with an E, so it exits the brain. Afferent arrives at the brain, efferent exits the brain. Now a lot of folks are like, that still doesn't do it for me. Let me bring up another mnemonic for you. And before I bring up a mnemonic, whenever you find something that's complex in your schooling, oftentimes it's great if a teacher can teach you a sneaky way to learn. Like you're learning the treble clef. Every good boy does fine. You're studying the Great Lakes, Holmes, Huron Interior, Michigan, Erie, Superior. Well, when you're studying afferent efferent, oftentimes they sound the same. Sensory, afferent, motor, efferent. Now that's pretty clever, and some of you are going to write that down. Here's my question. When you're reading your book for this class and for other classes, can you do that on your own? Can you come up with mnemonics on your own? If you can, your academic future is going to be a lot easier. If you're relying on someone else to do this for you, that's going to be tough. Motor. All right, let's look at interneurons. Interneurons really might sound boring because we can understand a motor neuron is going to make our bicep flex. Sensory neuron, ooh, did we see a flash of light? Did we hear the right note in band class? But an interneuron is cool because really that's where the magic happens. What that means is if neurons are designed to communicate, interneurons are the ones that communicate with a lot of neurons. So if neuron is going to talk to 10,000 other interneurons, and those interneurons are going to talk to 10,000 other interneurons, you can see the complexity, you can see the magic of human thought happens because, again, not number of synapses, not number of neurons, number of connections. All right, let's talk about mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are something called canonical neurons. And they really offer us evidence that, you know what, we are connected to everyone. Because when you see someone smile, part of your brain will smile. How can your brain smile? Well, one more time. You don't feel pain with your brain. You don't feel pain with your skin. And you certainly don't see with your eyes. And you darn sure don't smile with your mouth. You smile with your brain. You feel pain in your brain, even though your brain doesn't have pain receptors. If you're really confused, good, this stuff's complicated. So what do I mean by mirror neurons? If you were to see someone smile, if you were to see someone grimace in pain, not only will you notice it, but part of your brain will react. The part of your brain that smiles will react to their smile. So we almost, in many ways, feel what someone else feels. Now, some of you got like, I don't smile. And maybe you shouldn't laugh. Maybe you're at a funeral and you start laughing and you're like, that's probably not a good idea. So maybe you cover it up. But it doesn't mean if you see someone smile and you purposely don't smile, your brain's still smiling. Why do we care about this? This is important. It allows us to feel other people and maybe, just maybe, imagine how they see us. For lack of a better word, it's kind of like communication of intentions. If we see someone smiling, we know what that feels like. And so we probably know what they're thinking. And if we know what they're thinking, maybe we can communicate better. If we look at this from the evolutionary paradigm, Mother Nature never does anything by accident. So why would we have mirror neurons? Well, now we can have a young cave mother looking at her cave baby and it's grimacing in pain. Therefore, she feels anxiety. She's going to act in a way to stop the baby from being in pain. If you don't respond to your friend's smiles, your friend's nervous laughter, then you're not a very good friend. So we have to feel what each other feels. This is a possible avenue for investigating autism. Do autistic folks have less mirror neurons? I don't know. All right, do autistic folks mirror neurons? Do they not communicate as well? Again, I don't know. There's so much that's not known. But if we can see mirror neurons are really related with social cues and emotional response, maybe, just maybe, this is how we should look for it. Really similar to mirror neurons are what are called canonical neurons. Neurons involved in actively mimicking someone else's body language. We do it unconsciously. We don't think about it. When you're sitting at lunch, cafeteria, or just watching someone at the bus stop, watch two people talking because they're going to share the same body expression. Arms crossed, scratching their head. People unconsciously do this. Feature detectors are another type of individual neuron, and they're tempting for us to jump on them because they're so elegantly simple. A feature neuron is like one neuron that allows us to see one physical feature in the environment. So we could have a physical feature for a vertical line. We could have one single neuron for a vertical line, one single neuron for a horizontal line. Maybe we have a feature detector for a certain wavelength of color. Maybe we have a feature detector for a certain shape or a corner or an edge. Seeing a vertical line, seeing contrast between light and dark is a relatively simple thing. I don't think we have one neuron for anger. I don't think we have one neuron for happiness. Happiness and anger are pretty complex. You can't go, here's the happiness neuron, because there's different types of happiness. Generally, the more complex something is, the more neurons you need to have. I'll say it again. The more complex something is, the more neurons you need to have. You might be able to find the sneeze center in the brain. Sneezing is a reflex. You don't think about it. Are you going to have the sports center in the brain? I wouldn't think so, because the sports, well, whatever sports are, they're pretty complex. They involve a lot of things. Talking about glial cells. Why do we care about glial cells? Well, for the longest time, no one did. For nearly 100 years, or over 100 years, no one cared about glial cells. They were like the bass player in a rock band. Everyone's worried about the drummer and the lead guitar. We call those neurons. Glial cells, like, they're not important. Think about it. In 1887, when the first neuron was stained, okay, that's like, aha, that's how we think. And neurons are cool, man, they're sexy. Why? Because they produce electricity. And you can put an EEG on someone's head and you can see their brain waves. Glial cells, they were thought of as like dumb or dumb servants, the butlers of the brain. All they do is bring the cool, awesome neurons, nutrition, and remove cell waste. And because they didn't produce electricity, they were ignored. They weren't picked up by EEGs. We're finding out that glial cells definitely do communicate. And so you're like, okay. For you, that's just another vocabulary word. Glial cells, G for gray matter, just another word. Who cares? Big deal. Well, let me show you maybe why you should care. If we look at how many neurons there are, okay, there are 100, I hope I get this right, 100 billion neurons. So if neuron A, I'm obviously simplifying this ridiculously, but I think you get it. Neuron A talks to neuron B. That's a thought. All right. Neuron A talks to neuron C. That's a thought. B talks to C. That's a thought. Do this by a trillion. A talks to B, talks to C, talks to D. That's a trillion. But if D talks to B to C, you can see where we're going. 100 billion neurons. All right. Well, here's what we're looking at. We have nearly an infinite amount of combinations. Now we're going to do something a little more. Let's do a little math. It's going to be hard for you. How many numbers are between 1 and 2? An infinite. Because a neuron could fire 1 time a second. It could fire 1.5 times a second. So now we got the question, if a neuron in your toe tells your brain at 1 time per second, that could be an itch. 5 times a second, that could be a sting. So not only do we have the number of combinations, we have the rate of firing, like rate of firing. Why don't we use the euphemism, a projectile delivery system. So you're walking around in my neighborhood and a bullet whizzes over my head. I'm like, ain't no big deal, right? That was 1 time per night I get shot at. No big deal, it's where I come from, right? On the other hand, if someone starts peppering me with bullets and they're firing an automatic, 50 rounds per second sends a different signal than 1 round per second. So the rate of neural firing sends a different signal. And if each neuron can fire at a different rate, oh, and we have 100 billion of them, oh, and they can assemble in a different communication, I think you're starting to see the brain is pretty close to infinite. But wait, there's more. Because now we're talking about glial cells. And glial cells, which we now know are not the dumb servants of the brain, there are 900 billion glial cells. And they talk to each other. And they talk to neurons. So you really have a trillion cells that can communicate with each other. So is it a trillion to the trillionth power? With the concept of rate of firing, we also haven't said that there's different types of chemicals that talk with different neurons. So if neurons communicate, they don't use words, they use chemicals. And if we have different chemicals, that could mean a totally different signal. So here's the question. Are we infinite in our ability to think? We're like, sure. Or is there a number? I know it's a big number, but is there a number that's our ceiling? Is that what happens when we die? We can't think anymore? Oh, we used them all up? Go ahead.
You always say like you can't think of like a new color, so you really
You can't be infinite if you can't think of a new color. It's a really good point. So what's that color you've never seen? I would like you all right now, if anyone has courage, I would like you to make a sound you've never heard before. No one's going to try it? No, it wasn't the sound. That's okay. You can ask a question. He's like, I've heard that sound. No, go ahead.
You know, like, you ever like make a sound accidentally and no one has ever heard it before?
Only in church. That's not right. I don't know what that even meant. I just thought it was going to be funny. You all were laughing. All right. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, we do make random sounds, but it's always, check this out. Any sound that you can make right now is based on some sound you've heard before. You take a little bit of this sound, a little bit of that sound, you put it together. You've never made it, but it's basically based on your own experience. I would like you to make a sound based on an experience you've never had. Can you get the logic? You cannot think of a color you've never seen before? Everyone nod. Can you make a sound you've never heard before? I don't know. I don't know. Question and then question. Nope, you don't get to learn. Aha. All right. I don't want to be here. You don't want to be here. We're stuck together. I don't like you. You don't like me.